Thank you very much. It is 10:30. We have a very long programme, so I thought we should kick-start the event on time, and we've more or less done that. And my first duty is to introduce the Ceann Comhairle, Deputy Seán Ó Feargháil, to launch the event today.
John. Come back. He's coming back. It's okay. When you should say Gahintag Vahancho Ermagin, done Okot Specialta Shaw, agus Trace Liam Lagactin, Tatration of Parchik and Agricon on Leonu. It's great to come up from Kildare on a Saturday morning and find that the N7 for once wasn't absolutely chock-a-block. And would you believe it, I got here in just about an hour, where on an ordinary weekday, which I'm used to travelling, I could take up to 2 hours to make it from Kildare to Dublin. But as I said, it's a pleasure to say just a few opening words of welcome at this important conference. As Ceann Comhairle, I'm honoured to do so, and I thank the organisers for their invitation. A wide range of academics and political experts will address you over the course of the morning, so I propose keeping my opening remarks to a minimum. It is significant that we should mark the 1918 general election here in Wynn's Hotel in Abbey Street. Burnt to the ground during the 1916 Rising, it had earlier served as a meeting venue to explore the creation of what became the Irish Volunteers from 1913. Perhaps if we listen carefully, we can hear the murmuring echoes of Bulmer Hobson, Professor Owen O'Neill and the O'Rahilly. And I often wonder what those patriots of 100 years ago would whisper to us sitting here in Dublin City this morning. In 4 short generations, Ireland has evolved and politically matured into a small and assertively confident in its place in a more unified Europe, Brexit excluded, God help us. A more culturally diverse nation, looking outward beyond our borders to the enormous potential for growth and development in a world with 24-hour news cycles, insistent and persistent social media, and a barrage of news, both real and, as President Trump might say, fake. Those grainy photographs of December 1918 tell a different story. They tell a story which is one of optimism, of hope for a new political way of doing business, the birth of a new nation which saw its place assertively on the international stage. Now, I'm not a historian, so I'm not qualified to say if that hope and aspiration of December 1918 was dashed by the political and moral fog and parochialism of the 1930s and 40s. But when I think of those men, and sadly few were women, elected to Westminster 100 years ago, taking their seat in the first Dáil, I think of vitality, of courage, and of hope against the odds, overcoming so many obstacles to the building of a creative and imaginative new state. The election of 1918 marked a turning point in the evolution of Ireland's struggle for nationhood in the 20th century. Since becoming Ceann Comhairle in March 2016, I've been honoured to attend various functions marking events in the decade of centenaries. Like many others, I'm enormously impressed with the dignity, the respect and maturity with which these important dates have been commemorated. Easter 1916 and the Battle of the Somme saw Irish men in different uniforms lay down their lives for what they thought was right. I spoke at a commemoration for John Redmond and one for Cathal Brugha, and I made the point that both these men were patriots. They held radically different views on the best way forward for their country, their island, their nation, but they always had Ireland's best interests in their own hearts. And I think as we commemorate and honour the Irishmen who died in the GPO and the Irishmen who died in the distant, muddy mire of Flanders, we are maturing as a nation and as a people. And the events of December 1918 set in train a series of historical threads, deeply woven into our national consciousness. The general election led to the first Dáil, which led to a bitter war of independence, a deeply divided debate on a treaty, and then the dreadful days, months and years of civil war. These events are ahead of us, but I hope they will be commemorated and honoured with the same level of dignity, of grace and respect as other events up to now. I wish this conference every success. The Houses of the Oireachtas have significant plans to mark the first Dáil on the 21st of January 2019. I commend the organisers here for scheduling so many different speakers with a range of different historical and political voices. Following the shaking of the tectonic plates of Irish politics on the 14th of December 1918, we were never to look backwards. A tremendous momentum was created, which often felt in danger of losing control of itself. As I have said many times before, Dublin in those wet winter months of December 1918 and January 1919 must have been a very exciting time to be alive. We current politicians could do well, I say, to reclaim some of the ambition, the drive, the energy and the optimism of those early founders of our Parliament and emerging state. Go raibh maith.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle, for those words, and indeed thank you for your presence here today. And since I have to chair the proceedings for the rest of the day, thank you also for your advice earlier on how to control an unruly assembly. And let's hope this one is not. And let's hope this one is not going to be too unruly. We have a distinguished panel of speakers, and I want first of all to pay tribute to our host and organiser, Mert O'Sullivan, for putting together this latest in a series of seminars which he has organised entirely on his own initiative to mark the decade of commemorations. I can think of few other people who, when he puts out a call for papers, can secure the services not only of the Ceann Comhairle, but also of two former Taoiseach. 50% of the cohort of living former Taoiseach. It is... It is a remarkable achievement. I'm very happy to be associated with this endeavour and to have been asked to chair the seminar today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Felix Larkin, now working as a historian, but in a previous life as a public servant. I had the pleasure and good fortune of working for both John Bruton and Bertie Ahern when they were Ministers for Finance. Our topic today, the 1918 general election, is something which I think we can commemorate without reservation. We have become accustomed to celebrating the 1916 Rising as the foundational event of the independent Irish state, but some of us are uncomfortable with that, since there was no popular mandate for the Rising. In fact, it was deplored by the vast majority of the Irish people when it occurred. It is therefore far more appropriate to date the origin of our democratic state to the 1918 general election and the meeting of the first Dáil in January 1919. Orderly political events reflecting the will of the people, not wanton violence, disrespecting public opinion. And let us not forget that in contrast to 1916, the violence of the Irish War of Independence derived at least a veneer of legitimacy from the mandate for independence given by the 1918 general election and from being prosecuted, at least nominally, under the authority of Dáil Éireann. So today, in commemorating the 1918 general election, we celebrate our democracy, and it is right and proper that we should do this. Our first two speakers are outstanding sons of that democracy, the two former Taoiseach who are with us today, Bertie Ahern and John Bruton. And to begin the proceedings proper of our conference, I now call on Bertie Ahern to address us.
Thank you very much, Chairman and Felix, and good to meet up with you again, and thank you for all your excellent work and service for all of us. It's a great honour to be here and to share the platform with John Bruton and to be part of this whole event. Glad to see an old friend, Senator Jim, here as well. I know a number of people have travelled long distances to be here. I was having a cup of tea downstairs and just checking where people have travelled for. I don't know what happened overnight, but I wasn't aware that the Belfast bus should be stopped or could be stopped and your passports checked on the way to here. But anyway, we'll find out what happened. But anyway, to the people from Belfast that were on that bus that were checked, I guess it was to do with immigration, to do with a different problem. But anyway, if I'm talking to Teresa later in the day, I'll tell her what happened anyway. It's great to be with John. I know John was talking about that issue during the week in a very fine debate as well. I want to thank Murta. I know Murta's had a hard week, Murta Sullivan, and I know family events haven't been kind to you this week, Murta. You're still here and have had a very hard-working week on this event too. I remember when I got the invitation from Murta, and I looked at it and I said, how is he going to put a conference like that together so quick? When he said I was one of the early ones he was getting on to. And then Sandra pointed out to me that the date, this was in October 2017, when Sandra said, no, but he's talking about the 15th of December 2018. So Murt, thanks for the notice. And I'm glad I'm alive to be still here so long. Thank you for that. And to all of you who've gathered for today, I know it's a really good event, and really it's lovely to be in this area. I was born up the road in the Rotunda, baptised around the corner in the Pro. Lived a few miles down the road. It only took me a few minutes to get in this morning with no traffic, and I agree totally with my friend at Ceann Comhairle when he said if only every day was like a Saturday we could all get around. But maybe Ceann Comhairle we should switch the working week and or maybe move to the 4-day week as they're doing in some parts of the world. But Chairman, almost 100 years ago on the 14th of December 1918, Irish people voted in an election that was arguably the most significant exercise in democratic expression in 20th century Ireland, and set this country on a course for an independent nationhood. And Irish history is often controversial terrain, and people will take very different interpretations from the salient facts, but I don't think anyone will dispute that some of the joints of Irish history, names that were held in dominant role in our history books, were participants in that election. As a former politician and someone who contested 10 general elections, I can tell you that election candidates are always interested in the other names on the ballot paper, or indeed the names that are not on the ballot paper. So in preparing for today's conference, one of my first points of research was to look at the list of various candidates in 1918. And I searched for understanding of an election that was fought a century ago with a very different electoral demographic than today. It was also an election, Chairman, that was fought under different rules to our modern electoral procedures. Here I'm thinking specifically of the fact that the 1918 election was fought under a first-past-the-post system, as proportional representation, which has been a staple of Irish elections post-independence, was not introduced until 1921. In more modern times, it's probably ironic that my former party, Fianna Fáil, tried to do away with the PRSTV in failed referenda in 1959 and 1968. Yet undoubtedly the scale of Fianna Fáil losses in 2011 would have been even further magnified had there been a first-past-the-post system. There is exactly what happened to the Irish Parliamentary Party in 1918. The Irish Parliamentary Party entered meltdown territory in this election, which was most likely would have been avoided in a proportional representation scenario. In 1918, the Irish Parliamentary Party won 6 seats in the first-past-the-post system. 5 of these seats were in Ulster. where they have benefited from some tactical voting by unionists, while the only seat the Irish Parliamentary Party won in what now constitutes the 26th county state was in Waterford City, a seat which was previously the political base of John Redmond, who had died just some months earlier. And though people talk about the Irish Parliamentary Party vote imploding, they actually won a fairly respectable 21.7% of the vote on an all-Ireland basis in 1918. And under a proportional representation electorate system, they would have easily won far more seats and arguably done enough to make the party sustainable into the long-term future. How that would or would not have changed the direction of Irish history is one of those ifs that could give rise to endless speculation. Rather than do that at this point, let me return to the runners and riders of candidates in the 1918 general election. Given my own political background, I hope people will forgive me if I start with one of my predecessors, Eamon de Valera. Subsequently, the figure who would dominate 20th century Irish politics as leader of Fianna Fáil, but at this stage, the leader of Sinn Féin. De Valera was actually returned for 2 constituencies in the 1918 election. Building on his by-election victory in 1917, De Valera was elected unopposed in Clare East in 1918, but he also won a contested seat in Mayo East, ending the political career of John Dillon, who had taken over the leadership of the Irish Parliamentary Party 6 months earlier in March of 1918, at a very difficult and transformative time. W.T. Cosgrave was also elected unopposed in Kilkenny North. Arthur Griffin was elected unopposed in Cavan East, and he also won a contested constituency in Tyrone North West, comfortably beating an Irish unionist, William Thomas Miller. Griffith's victory was one of the few Sinn Féin wins in the North East. Though undoubtedly the 1918 general election was a triumph for Sinn Féin, unionists actually increased their overall representation by 5 seats. On an all-Ireland basis, people voted in a more polarising manner, either for the Union or for the Republic, as moderate nationalists were swept away. Some might argue that the seeds of partition were accordingly sown in this election, but this process can even be traced even further back to Parnell's inability to make inroads into Unionist Ulster. Other famous uncontested candidates in 1918 were the legendary Michael Collins in Cork South, who was already making a name for himself, Terence McSweeney in Cork Mid, who would lose his life after 74 days of hunger strikes and Brixton prison less than 2 years later, and Sean Hales in Cork West. Hales ended up fighting on the opposite side of the Civil War from his brother Tom, showing that the brother against brother description of the Civil War was no cliché, as the remarkable Republican unity that had existed from 1917 to 1921 truly unravelled in the dreadful and blood-stained events of 22 and 23, which remains one of the great tragedies of our history. In contested constituencies, Sinn Féin were rampant. Shanti O'Callaghan, a future 2-term president, was Victoria in College Green in this actual area, easily defeating the independent nationalist Joe Briscoe. Desmond Fitzgerald, the father of a future Taoiseach, was elected in Dublin Pembroke, despite a good showing from an Irish unionist, John P. Good. And Countess Margaret made history when she was elected in Dublin St. Patrick's with 66% of the vote, becoming the first woman to be elected as an MP. Though, as we all know, she declined to take her seat in Westminster, staying true to her election pledge of abstentionism from the British Parliament. Overall, 25 Sinn Féin candidates in 1918 were returned unopposed in the 73 constituencies where Sinn Féin candidates were elected. Geographically, the largest province where Sinn Féin candidates were not opposed was Munster, which was the bedrock of Republican activity in the Civil War and arguably also in the War of Independence. 17 Sinn Féin candidates were returned unopposed in Munster in 1918. A revisionist historian's argument frequently made is that high levels of violence or the threat of violence distorted the 1918 general election and that anti-Republican candidates were discouraged from running by threats. Not surprisingly, this argument was also made by the censored British-controlled press in Ireland at this time 100 years ago. With the benefit of hindsight and genuine historical research, it is clear that the uncontested seats were the result of Sinn Féin and the Irish Parliamentary Party finding common ground in some constituencies, and in other constituencies, the acceptance of electoral realpolitik, where it was realised that Sinn Féin were going to be the certain winners. Those who continue to suggest that the uncontested constituencies unfairly distorts the 1918 election ignore the reality that subsequently in these constituencies and in future elections, Republican candidates performed very, very strongly. And this indicates that these constituencies were most likely also a hotbed of Republican support in 1918, and that non-Republicans saw it as pointless to contest these constituencies. Chairman, like the uncontested constituencies, those constituencies where there were contests in 1918 provide some interesting insights into history. Owen McNeill actually fought and contested 2 constituencies in 1918, and he won them both, in the parliamentary constituencies of Londonderry City and also the National University of Ireland. Edward Carson, a Dublin-born lawyer and former Trinity hurler, won 81% of the votes cast in Belfast Duncarn. More surprising maybe for some of us today, Maurice Dockrell, an independent unionist alliance candidate in Dublin Rathmines, convincingly won a seat in 1918, and unlike the bulk of Irish MPs elected in this election, Dockrell did take a seat in the House of Commons. However, his grandson, also Maurice, in the post-independence era, became a long-serving Fine Gael TD in Dáil Éireann. Interestingly, Maurice Dockrell's senior vanquished opponent in Rathmines in 1918 was P.J. Little, who did not let this defeat deter his appetite for politics, as he was subsequently a long-serving member of De Valera's Fianna Fáil cabinets in the 1930s and the 1940s. 2 men who were to be casualties of Civil War bitterness, Kevin O'Higgins for Queen's County, now thankfully County Laois, and Harry Boland for Roscommon South, were also winners of contested constituencies in 1918. And for those who think that West Belfast was always a Sinn Féin stronghold, it might be interesting to note that Joseph Devlin, an Irish parliamentary candidate, won 72% of the vote in the constituency of Belfast Falls, easily defeating his only opponent, who was none other than Eamon de Valera, the Sinn Féin leader. As a political leader, I used to tell my party colleagues that a general election was a series of local elections, and the personalities, the demographics, the issues in local constituencies can submerge a national trend. There is no doubt that this is what happened in Belfast Falls in 1918, but in this general election, it was an exception rather than the rule. Chairman, the immediate background of the 1918 election explains the overall national surge to Sinn Féin. The 1916 rising, as you mentioned, the execution that transformed and radicalised nationalist Ireland as never before. Yeats spoke of all being changed and a terrible beauty being born in the events of Easter week, and it seemed to have given impetus to the cause of an Irish Republic and a shift away from what had been the Irish political orthodoxy of Home Rule. Sinn Féin won all 4 by-elections in Ireland in 1917, but the swing to Sinn Féin seemed to have dissipated by early 1918, when the Irish Parliamentary Party retained 3 seats in by-elections early that year. And while local factors and sympathy votes may have been a factor, there are also grounds to believe that passions had abated since the executions of 1916, and that the Irish Republicans were prepared to give constitutional nationalism and the Irish Parliamentary Party in particular one last chance of achieving a workable solution. The failure of the Irish Convention by March 1918, the conscription crisis of April 1918, and the German plot of May 1918, where Sinn Féin leaders were arrested on trumped-up charges by the British authorities, all served to push momentum back in the direction of Sinn Féin and led to the death knell of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Last year it was my pleasure to speak in Trinity College with John Bruton as well at the centenary of the opening of the Irish Convention. When this convention opened in July 1917, Britain was in danger of death struggle for its survival and its way of life, and the Great War, which had broken out in 1914, was still perched on a knife edge. In my view, the Irish Convention was a cynical manoeuvre by the British Prime Minister Lloyd George. The convention was about keeping Unionists and Nationalists on board with the war effort by kicking the problem of the Government of Ireland down the road. It was also hoped that more militant nationalists such as Sinn Féin would engage with the Irish Convention and that this would keep them occupied rather than engaged in further military action. The failure of the Irish Convention by spring 1918 and also the failure of the Irish parliamentary party to secure anything better than Home Rule with partition persuaded National Ireland that it was time to speak and to seek new solutions, and that Sinn Féin could perhaps provide more dynamism and energy. Chairman, it would be naive, I think, of any of us to think that Lloyd George was a friend of Nationalist Ireland. He ultimately betrayed John Redmond and John Dillon, who had backed the British war effort. By linking the introduction of Home Rule with conscription, Lloyd George was putting British interests first and foremost and placing the Irish Parliamentary Party in an impossible position. On the official announcement of the dual policy of Home Rule and conscription in April 1918, Dillon led the Irish Parliamentary Party members out of the Commons, never to return. The electoral side was now unstoppably moving towards Sinn Féin. Arthur Griffin, the founder of Sinn Féin, convincingly won the East Cavan by-election on the 20th of June 1918, defeating the Irish Parliamentary Party's John F. O'Hanlon by over 1,200 votes and winning a seat that had been held by Home Rulers since the constituency was established in 1885. The December 1918 election, ladies and gentlemen, that followed was known as the Khaki election and was called immediately after the armistice with Germany. Lloyd George campaigned on the slogan of "Make the Germans pay," and we all know how that tragically worked out, and he won a huge victory in Britain. But the Irish vote was a seat changer for separatism. Sinn Féin won 73 seats, the Irish Parliamentary Party 6, and Unionists 26 seats. Sinn Féin's landslide was helped by the fact that Irish soldiers returning from the front, who were least likely to vote for a severing of the link with Britain, had difficulty in obtaining ballot papers. Furthermore, the extension of the franchise to a younger generation, men over 21 and females over 30, was a great benefit to the more radical Sinn Féin rather than to the conservative and middle-aged dominated Irish Parliamentary Party. I'm not a sociologist or a political scientist, but nearly 40 years' experience in general elections have taught me that young people are more willing to embrace change and to reject establishment parties, as the Irish Parliamentary definitely was in Ireland in 1918. And the ongoing and unnecessary arrest of Sinn Féin directors of elections during the campaign by the British authorities also generated sympathy and offended the Irish electorate's sense of fair play. Sinn Féin also benefited from the Labour Party's decision to sit out the 1918 general election to allow the electorate focus on the national question. However, I've said this before, but I don't go along with the sometimes cited excuse that the historical weakness of the Labour Party in Ireland is explained by this decision because it deprived the party of supporters from the beginning. Voters cast their ballots on the policies and the more recent track records of political parties, not what they did or didn't do in 1918. In my view, the outcome of the 1918 general election is historically and politically significant because it signalled democratic support for the philosophy that underpinned the Easter Rising, and it gave it a mandate. In their time, to those wishing to push on with the work of building a sovereign, independent nation in Ireland. If one thing annoys me about Irish revisionist historians, it's a tendency that some of them have to take cheap shots at the leaders of Easter Rising. The 1916 leaders were Irish Democrats, and that is not recognised sufficiently often. They were or became revolutionaries because they refused to confine their vision to a limited devolution in a truncated Ireland that would remain in the UK as a satellite of the British Empire. That was the only concession that could be expected in a British-imposed constitutional framework. The sacrifice they made of their own lives was the catalyst for a sea change in public opinion, expressed in the ballot box in Ireland in December 1918, which henceforth supported complete independence. And those who criticised the leaders of the Rising ignored the fundamental democratic principle that one country does not have the right to govern another without its consent. Yet, that is what Britain had been doing in Ireland for centuries. The vision and the bravery of the men and women of 1916 in their lives and in their deaths was recognised by the Irish people, who in December 1918 decided to back the cause of an independent republic by a massive and sweeping majority. The justice of the cause, not just the willingness to fight for it, contributed much to the success. Irish democratic institutions were formed, at the first available opportunity following the overwhelming victory of Sinn Féin in 1918 general election, on the two principles of self-determination and government by consent. From then on, Ireland had an elected government of its own in Dáil Éireann, which first sat on the 21st of January 1919. We're now well into the decade of centenaries, as the chairman has said, in the Ceann Comhairle. As Taoiseach, I announced in October 2005 that my government would put a particular focus on the 90th anniversary of the Rising, and it would commence planning for a major commemoration of the 100th anniversary in 2016. When I made this announcement, it was the subject of some criticism, even from some of those who are now today firm supporters of the programme of historic commemorations. But I'm really glad that successive governments have all played a role in making, in the most inclusive possible manner, the passage into history of both the great achievements and deep wounds associated with Ireland's transition to political independence. It is important that we commemorate our past and that we also learn from it. And in this context, I want to say that the decision to downgrade history in our secondary schools and to make it a non-compulsory subject was short-sighted and, quite frankly, ill-considered. I know that the current Minister of Education is revisiting the decision, and I hope he will recognise that our young people learning about the suffering and loss and sacrifices that have taken place to give this country its nationhood emphasises the imperative of building for the future a just and peaceful Ireland for everybody. In this regard, I'm tempted to say that the compulsory teaching of Irish history would also be included in the syllabus in Britain. One of the many major disappointments of the Brexit debate is the sheer ignorance and sometimes arrogance of the realities of Irish history and Irish political affairs as expressed by some Brexiteers. I can certainly think of a few former Eton and Oxford students who've been contributing vocally, if not sensibly, to the Brexit debate, who could do a crash course in the lessons of Irish history. Brexit, as I've said, Chairman, so many times, cannot be allowed to unravel the good work of the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. 20 years ago, the people of this island voted for a shared future that would be based on democratic ideals and would underpin a new era of prosperity and progress for all of us. On the 22nd of May, 1998, the people of the island voted by a huge majority in both jurisdictions to end once and for all the wrenching conflicts of the past. Nobody here needs reminding that our generation has borne witness to the tragic results of a conflict that has cost thousands of lives and caused colossal damage and disturbance to the lives of many more people, holding back the natural progress of a whole society and indeed an entire island. It has been in human terms one of the most costly history lessons that we should have been able to steer clear of at that and take any shortcut. The Good Friday Agreement was a culmination of many years' effort devoted to the peace process, of the three-stranded talks which began over a quarter of a century ago in 1991 and involved the dedicated work of 4 Taoiseach, including John and myself. The agreement represents the product of perhaps the most rigorous negotiations ever seen in these islands, involving nationalists and unionists, loyalists and republicans. The significance of the Good Friday Agreement should never be underestimated, and to use modern parlance, it was a game changer. The ratification by the Irish people, North and South, of the agreement was the first concurrent act of self-determination by the people of Ireland as a whole since that general election of 1918. The yes vote in the referendum of more than 85% of the poll in the whole island of Ireland was a rare expression of near unanimity by the people of the island and a clear signal that we were not prepared to countenance any false remnant of democratic self-justification for further acts of parliamentary violence from any quarter. As I conclude, can I say that the idea of concurrent referendums, North and South, and to build democratic consensus around the Good Friday Agreement belonged to John Hume, as I'm very glad to help implement this idea. John was always an astute politician with a huge intellectual depth and someone deeply read in Irish history. He saw the dangers of militant Irish nationalism being irreversibly wedded to a long expired and disputed mandate, given in the 1918 general election. He wanted to empower a new generation to write and shape their own version of history. And for John Hume and for me, this had to be underpinned by a fair and honourable accommodation between unionists and nationalists based on partnership, cooperation and mutual respect in relationships within Northern Ireland, between North and South and between Ireland and Britain. All of us who engaged in the Good Friday talks had come to understand that this does not mean an end to difference. It did not spell defeat for either of the two great traditions of nationalism or unionism. Instead, it spelled victory for the people who wanted to coexist in peace and harmony on this island. Chairman, the 1918 general election in Ireland gave rise to the Dáil and our democratic institutions on this island. But on the same day that the Dáil sat, for the first time on the 21st of January 1919, the first shots rang out in the War of Independence. It is right that we never forget our history, and we remember a century later those who fought for and campaigned to vindicate the Irish people's right to self-determination. But it is this generation's duty to ensure that we leave a lasting political framework on this island, which will mean no one will ever again have to fight or have to die for Ireland's sake, and that all the people on this island can live in peace, in prosperity and in harmony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.